Hello and welcome back. My name is Clayton, and I'm your host. This is episode 4 in the Volumetric Time Model series. So far, we've been building this picture one piece at a time. In episode 1, we talked about the difference between existence and access. We said reality can be fully consistent, while your personal experience of it is still partial, delayed, noisy, and incomplete, because you are inside the situation, not above it. Then in episode 2, we gave a name to a feeling a lot of people know very well. Forecasting without power. That strange experience where you can see what is coming, you can sense the shape of the outcome. You can almost call the ending ahead of time, and yet your hands do not connect strongly enough to the situation to really change where it is headed. Then in episode 3, we introduced the agency horizon, the point where your actions stop, meaningfully steering the outcome you care about. You are still acting. You are still trying. You may even understand the situation very clearly. But the connection between what you do and what happens next has become too weak, too delayed, too noisy, or too late to matter in the way you need. And that brings us to today, because once you understand that agency can shrink, the obvious next question is this: can it grow? Can it be strengthened? Can you push the horizon back? That is what this episode is about. Today, I want to talk about how ordinary people can widen agency in normal life. Not through magic, not through becoming perfect, not through some fantasy of total control. I mean something much more practical. How do you make it more likely that your actions actually connect to reality in time to matter? How do you stop problems from hardening into momentum? How do you keep life from becoming one long chain of reaction, panic, cleanup, and regret? How do you build a setup where your choices land earlier, more clearly, and with more effect? That is the goal today. Now, the first big idea is simple. Agency often grows not when you push harder, but when you act earlier. That is a huge shift. A lot of people imagine agency as force. More effort, more willpower, more discipline, more intensity, more pressure, more pushing. And yes, sometimes force matters. Sometimes you really do need grit. Sometimes you do need to dig deep. But in ordinary life, a lot of agency is not about pushing harder on the wheel. It is about touching the wheel sooner. That difference matters a lot. Think about steering a ship. If you notice the current early, a small correction can change the whole path. If you wait too long, you may need a huge correction. And if you wait even longer, the ocean starts doing most of the choosing for you. That is how a lot of life works. A relationship is often easier to repair when the issue is still small, awkward, and easy to dismiss. A health problem is often easier to steer when it still feels like a vague pattern instead of a crisis. Money is often easier to manage when the problem is still a lack of structure, not a collapsing buffer. Stress is easier to handle when it still feels like friction, not breakdown. But here is the trap. When a problem is still early, it usually does not feel dramatic enough. It does not feel urgent enough. It does not feel serious enough. So people wait. They tell themselves, it's probably fine. I'll deal with it later. It's not that bad. I can push through. And then later comes. And later is more expensive. Later has momentum. Later has accumulated damage. Later has less flexibility. Later has fewer options. And then people often do something very unfair to themselves. They look at the harder, later version of the problem, and they conclude that they are weak. But often the difference was not weakness. Often the difference was timing. That is one of the deepest practical truths in this whole framework. Earlier action beats stronger action surprisingly often. So if you want to widen agency, the first lesson is this: respect early signals. Do not wait for full disaster before you take a pattern seriously. Do not require pain to become enormous before you allow yourself to respond. A lot of real control lives in the boring stage. Before the emergency. Before the collapse. Before the thing becomes obvious to everybody. That is where steering is cheapest. Now here is the second big idea. Agency grows when feedback gets faster. This is one of the most useful ideas in the whole framework. You steer better when the gap between action and consequence becomes shorter and clearer. Let's make that very simple. Imagine trying to learn to play piano, but you only heard the notes you played 3 hours later. That would be a nightmare. You would not know what worked. You would not know what failed. You would not know what to correct. You would be trapped in delay. Now imagine the normal case. You press a key. You hear it instantly. That is a tight loop. Action, feedback, correction. That is how learning happens. That is how control works. The same is true in normal life. The faster and clearer your feedback, the more agency you have. The slower and blurrier your feedback, the more you drift. This is why so many simple, boring tools are powerful. A budget works because it shortens the distance between spending and awareness. A sleep routine works because it shortens the distance between behavior and how you feel the next day. A weekly check-in a relationship works because it shortens the distance between tension and repair. Journaling works because it helps you see patterns sooner. Tracking exercise works because effort stops being vague. These are not magical productivity rituals. They are loop, tightening tools. They help your actions connect to reality faster. And that is what agency needs. Think about money for a second. A lot of people do not feel powerless with money because they are stupid. They feel powerless because the feedback loop is blurry. They spend in scattered little ways. They avoid looking. They feel vaguely stressed. Then one day, they open the account and feel like they got hit by a truck. That is not a healthy control loop. That is delayed pain. And delayed pain is hard to steer. Now compare that with someone who checks things regularly, sees patterns earlier, notices drift sooner, and corrects before the problem turns theatrical. That person is not necessarily smarter. They just have a tighter loop. That is why they have more practical agency. So one of the smartest questions you can ask in any area of life is this: how do I get faster feedback here? How do I find out sooner whether what I'm doing is helping or hurting? That question alone can change a lot. Now the third big idea. Agency grows when noise goes down. This one is massive, because modern life is full of noise, digital noise, emotional noise, social noise, mental noise, informational noise. You are interrupted all day. You are overstimulated all day. You are comparing, scrolling, reacting, absorbing, decoding, and second, guessing all day. And then people wonder why life feels slippery. Well, imagine trying to navigate deep space while half your instruments are flickering. 3 alarms are going off and static is filling the channel. That is not just stressful. It makes steering worse, because steering depends on signal quality. The same thing happens in ordinary human life. If your environment is chaotic, if your attention is shattered, if your routines are unstable, if your communication is vague, if your inputs are constant, then cause and effect become harder to read. You stop knowing what is helping. You stop knowing what is hurting. You stop knowing whether you are reacting to reality or to noise. And when signal quality drops, agency shrinks. This is why widening agency is often less about adding more things and more about removing interference. Sometimes the answer is not another app, not another article, not another theory, not another productivity hack. Sometimes the answer is less clutter, less confusion, less distraction, less interpretive fog, cleaner routines, cleaner conversations, cleaner inputs. A life you can read is a life you can steer. That is worth remembering. A life you can read is a life you can steer. Now, let's move to another huge principle. Buffers. Buffers are one of the most underrated forms of agency in the real world. A buffer is breathing room. A buffer is margin. A money buffer means one bad. Surprise does not instantly become panic. A time buffer means one delay. does not destroy your entire day. An energy buffer means one rough week does not collapse your whole life. An emotional buffer means one stressful interaction does not fully hijack your state. Why do buffers matter so much? Because urgency compresses agency. When everything is immediate, you do not get to think. You do not get to choose well. You do not get to evaluate. You react. And reaction is not the same thing as steering. That distinction matters. A lot of people are living with so little margin that every problem arrives at full speed. Every bill is urgent. Every decision feels loaded. Every interruption feels costly. Every bad night of sleep spills into everything else. That kind of life is not just tiring. It shortens the horizon. Because when you have no cushion, even small shocks hit like major events. That means less flexibility. Less flexibility means less practical control. So if you want to push the horizon back, build buffers wherever you can. Not because buffers are glamorous, but because buffers preserve room. And room is one of the hidden ingredients of agency. Room to think. Room to notice. Room to recover. Room to redirect. Room to act before the situation chooses for you. Now here is another major idea. Agency grows when you move upstream. This one changes everything once you really see it. A lot of people spend their lives dealing with consequences instead of causes. They mop the floor over and over again without asking why the pipe keeps leaking. They keep fighting the same fire without changing the structure that keeps producing fire. They stay trapped in cleanup mode. And cleanup mode is exhausting. It is also deceptive, because it can make you feel busy while the real engine of the problem stays untouched. Upstream thinking asks a different question. Not just, how do I handle this result? But, what keeps creating this result in the first place? What is built into the setup? What pattern is quietly manufacturing this outcome again and again? That is where agency gets smarter. For example, if you are constantly tired, the issue may not be that you need more motivation. It may be that your evenings are overloaded, your sleep timing is unstable, your stress never drops, and your environment keeps stealing recovery from you. If your finances always feel shaky, the issue may not just be self-control. It may be that you have no visibility, no buffer, bad default habits, and a setup where one surprise can destabilize everything. If you keep having the same relationship argument, the issue may not be the last conversation. It may be the pattern underneath the conversations, the timing, the avoidance, the silence, the assumptions. The way repair gets delayed until everything is already too hot. Upstream changes often look less dramatic than downstream reactions, but they are usually much more powerful. Why? Because they change the future before it arrives. And that is what widening agency really means. Not winning the same battle harder. Changing the setup so the battle has less power over you in the first place. Now let's talk about something people often do not want to hear. Real agency is often boring. It does not always feel exciting. It does not always feel powerful. It often looks like routine. It looks like structure. It looks like maintenance. It looks like making life less dramatic. That is one reason people overlook it. We are emotionally drawn to breakthrough moments. We love the fantasy of the giant decision, the big turnaround, the sudden transformation, the dramatic comeback. But most real control in life is built much quietly than that. It looks like getting sleep before you are falling apart. It looks like checking the numbers before money becomes terrifying. It looks like clearing one source of chaos. It looks like one honest conversation before silence turns toxic. It looks like not waiting for motivation to become cinematic. It looks like preserving order in your life so that reality remains readable. This is good news, by the way, because it means agency is not reserved for geniuses or superheroes. It lives in the ordinary, in timing, in structure, in maintenance, in repeated contact with reality. That is where a surprising amount of practical power comes from. Now here is another really important principle. Agency grows when your inner story gets more accurate. This part matters because people do not just react to events. They react to their interpretation of events. And bad interpretation adds noise. Let's say something in your life is slipping. Your first response might be something like this: I always mess things up. I never change. I ruin everything. I'm hopeless. Now notice what that does. It does not clarify the situation. It does not tighten the loop. It does not improve feedback. It does not help you see timing, pattern, or leverage. It just adds shame. And shame is noisy. It clouds the channel. It pushes you toward panic, avoidance, or self-attack. That makes steering harder. So, one of the quiet ways to widen agency is to improve the quality of your internal description. Not fake positivity, not denial, not motivational nonsense, just better accuracy. Instead of saying, "My life is a disaster," you might say, "I'm seeing fragility in this part of the system." Instead of saying, "I'm broken," you might say, "This loop is getting harder to steer." Instead of saying, "I always fail," you might say, "I'm acting late inside a pattern that already has momentum." That is not softer. That is sharper. And sharper language gives you traction. It helps you diagnose instead of drown. And diagnosis is one of the foundations of agency. Now let's add another important point. Small wins matter for a deeper reason than most people realize. They are not just emotionally encouraging. They are structurally important. Why? Because successful small actions prove that the channel still works. They prove the loop is still alive. When you do something small and reality responds, your brain learns something crucial. It learns that this area is still steerable. That matters a lot. This is why small, consistent actions are often more powerful than giant declarations. A 10-minute walk that actually happens is better than a perfect future fitness identity that never arrives. A weekly money review is better than endless guilt and zero visibility. One direct conversation is better than 3 months of analysis and silence. One improved bedtime that sticks is better than promising yourself that tomorrow you become a flawless machine. Agency grows through repeated successful contact with reality. That is one of the most important lines in this episode. Agency grows through repeated successful contact with reality. Not fantasy, not self-punishment, not huge emotional speeches. Real contact, real response, real correction. That is how the horizon gets pushed back. Now there is another major point here. Sometimes widening agency does not mean controlling more things. Sometimes it means choosing the right target. This is so important because people waste an enormous amount of energy trying to control what is barely responsive, while ignoring what is still highly responsive. You cannot fully control other people. You cannot fully control the economy. You cannot fully control timing. You cannot fully control the past. You cannot fully control every outcome. But that does not mean you have no agency. It means you need better aim. Where does your influence still connect? That is the real question. Maybe you cannot force a relationship to work by yourself, but you can become clearer, earlier, more honest, less confusing. Maybe you cannot erase financial stress overnight, but you can improve visibility, reduce drift, and stop making the loop harder to read. Maybe you cannot reverse a long pattern instantly, but you can stop feeding it the same way. Maybe you cannot guarantee success, but you can improve the quality of your contact with reality. That is real agency. And real agency beats fantasy control every single time. Now let's zoom out and connect this back to the bigger picture. One of the deepest ideas in the volumetric time model is that life is not only about what exists. It is about what becomes accessible to you, when it becomes accessible, and how clearly it reaches you. Agency lives inside that world. It is not some giant magical force floating above time. It depends on timing. It depends on delay. It depends on feedback. It depends on noise. It depends on signal quality. It depends on how open the future still is when you finally act. That is why agency is not just a personality trait. It is also a structural condition, a situational condition, a timing condition, a signal condition. And once you really see that, something changes. You stop asking only, am I strong or weak? And you start asking better questions. Is the loop tight or loose? Is the signal clear or blurry? Am I acting early or late? Am I dealing with the cause or just the consequence? Am I building margin or living with no cushion? Am I reducing noise or feeding it? Am I putting energy where the system still responds? Those are much better questions. Those are steering questions. Those are agency questions. So let's bring this home in the simplest possible way. How do you push the horizon back? You act earlier. You tighten feedback loops. You reduce noise. You build buffers. You move upstream. You improve the accuracy of your inner story. You build small successful contact with reality. And you place your energy where the system is still responsive. That is how agency grows. Not perfectly, not infinitely, not all at once, but enough to matter. And that is the heart of this episode. You do not need total control to have meaningful agency. You just need a stronger connection between what you do and what happens next. That connection can weaken. It can blur. It can be delayed. It can be damaged. But it can also be improved. And once you understand that, you stop waiting for some giant heroic transformation. You start respecting timing, structure, signal quality, margin, feedback. You start seeing that a lot of control is built before crisis, not during it. And that may be one of the most useful lessons in this whole framework. Thank you for listening. My name is Ralph Clayton. This was episode 4 of the Volumetric Time Model series. And next time, we're going to move one step deeper. Because once you understand that prediction can survive longer than control, and once you understand how agency grows or shrinks in everyday life, the next question becomes even sharper. What exactly is the gap between seeing and steering? Why can you still read the direction of events, even after your ability to change them has begun to fade? That is what we'll talk about next. See you soon.